you. Hello. I was wondering who was that handsome man in the suit. So I'm going to talk for a while, and then I'm hoping to hear from you. So I want you to, know that I'm expecting you to come up with some intelligent questions, so that we can have a conversation afterwards. And I don't know if Dennis Mangers is still here. I understand he was here earlier, an old friend. Is George Raya in the audience? Hi, George. How are you? I like George so much because he's older than me, and I can't say that about too many people anymore. There's not many that have been doing what I do longer than George Raya. How many of you saw the film Milk? Well, I hope you weren't expecting Emile Hirsch and are now disappointed. But he did a good job on that. I, however, am significantly taller than Emile. But he did a wonderful job, and I hope all of you at some point have the experience of having some really hot person play you, because it was nice. I liked it. I joined the movement in 1967 when I was 13 years old, and it was the movement to end the war in Vietnam. We understood, especially after Dr. Martin Luther King explained it to us, that what was happening in Southeast Asia and our own country's role in that tragic period in history was directly related to the civil rights struggle here in the United States. My friends and I understood that, and we went to the anti-war marches, and we went to the civil rights rallies, and then when Cesar Chavez came to Arizona to organize the grape pickers in the fields there, my friends and I understood that that was also part of this larger struggle, and we signed on. It took a little while for word of the women's liberation movement to trickle down to dusty old Arizona, but when we heard about it, we signed up for that, and we circulated petitions for the Equal Rights Amendment and spoke out against violence against women. It wasn't until 1971 that I learned that part of this movement was especially for people like me. And I learned about it because I was pretending I had a lung disease so I didn't have to go to gym class because I got the crap beat out of me at gym class. So my doctor agreed that I had some strange lung malady and couldn't possibly go to gym class. He was a kind soul. And so whenever all the other boys were going to PE, I would go to the library and I would read and try to remember to cough every now and then. Oh, I'm so sick. And so one day I'm hiding out in the library, and I'm looking for magazines to read, and of course this was long before the internet or computers, and we had these quaint things called, they were made of paper, and they had ink on them, and they were called magazines. And one of them was Life magazine. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. And they published the Year in Review issue in 1971. So I'm hiding out in the library, and I'm reading this magazine, and suddenly this headline just about punches me in the face. It said, "Homosexuals in Revolt." And there were pictures from the Stonewall riots that had happened 2 years before in Manhattan, and there were pictures of gay people, lesbian women, gay men in New York, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, and other places who were organizing and building a community and building a movement. And I saw all these pictures of these hot guys with long hair and their fists in the air confronting the police, and I was like, oh my God, if I can just survive high school, I'm going to get the hell out of Phoenix, and I'm going to go to San Francisco. So that's what I did. And I arrived in San Francisco. I don't know how well you know our neighborhoods, but I landed in the Tenderloin. This idiot white child from the suburbs with hair down to his waist and no skills or education whatsoever. And my life was not easy at the beginning. It was pretty hard and sometimes quite scary. And I'm old now, but I've never forgotten it. And I know what it's like to not have food, and I know what it's like to be homeless, and I know what it's like to be afraid of the police, and I know what it's like to have to do things you don't want to do in order to survive. And unfortunately, these are issues that remain quite current. One of the things you may not understand is that when I came out and realized what I was and what that meant, that it was a felony. People went to prison for consensual sex between adults. In liberal San Francisco, until Willie Brown and George Moscone decriminalized homosexuality, approximately 2,000 men a year were being arrested for consensual sex between adults. And in every city in this country, there were special units within the police departments whose sole job was to entrap, arrest, and imprison gay men. And when they were arrested, their names were published in the newspaper, and they lost their jobs. And if they were married, as many were, they lost their families and their children. So that was the world that I came out to. It was a felony for people of the same sex to dance together, if you can imagine such a thing. So I got to San Francisco, and I struggled to survive and met some amazing people just through pure luck. I met early on Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, the women who started the Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian organization in the world. I met Jim Foster, who was the first openly gay person to speak to a national political convention when he spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 1972. And after a couple of years, I had the great good fortune to meet Harvey Milk. Harvey was incredibly kind to me. Sean Penn, I think, really did him justice in the film Milk. It was really quite astonishing to see how completely he inhabited Harvey's character. There was one day on set when several of us older people were sitting around, and Sean came out of the wardrobe trailer, and all of us went, "Oh my God, he's back!" You know, it was really, it was very startling. But what I really want you to know about Harvey Milk is that he was a real human being. And as he becomes increasingly mythologized and turns into this legend, it's important for you to know that he was a real person who lived 4 doors from me. His personal life was often in disarray. He was a terrible businessman. He was always broke. His life was full of all of the challenges and defeats and humiliations that so many of us experience in the course of our lifetimes. But he loved his city. He loved his people. He was uncompromising in his defense of our basic human rights. And because of that, he, in fact, did change the world. So I want you to know, and I hope all young people understand, that when we look at these mythic figures, they're people. And I, in my life, have had the most extraordinary good luck to meet and sometimes work with some of the most amazing people of our time. I met Nelson Mandela. I met Rosa Parks. I marched with Cesar Chavez. I was mentored by Harvey Milk. And I tell you, these were ordinary men and women. And the accomplishments that they achieved are all things that you yourselves should aspire to and understand that you can achieve these as well. Harvey was really good to me, and I was a terrible student. I hated school, sorry. I have the attention span of a lima bean, which is probably unfair to legumes, but Harvey bribed me, and he said, "You have to go back to school and I'll help you." So I went to San Francisco City College, and I enrolled in the film department, and I began making these little films on Super 8, you don't know what Super 8 was, Super 8 cameras. They were the first portable, affordable motion picture cameras. And I made a couple of films. And I took the one that I thought was best because Harvey and Scott and some other people were putting together a little film festival. It was held at 32 Page Street. Do you remember 32 Page Street, George? It was the first gay community center in San Francisco. And it was a film festival that goes on today. It's now called the San Francisco International Gay and Lesbian Film Festival and attracts tens of thousands of people from all over the world. But back then it was a sheet on a wall and some Super 8 films. And I showed Harvey mine, and he waited till nobody could hear, and he said, "Cleve, you have no talent at all. Girl, you need to change your major." "Oh, thanks, Harvey." But so he bribed me, and he said, "If you go to San Francisco State and get into the political science department, I'll let you come and work for me in City Hall after I get elected." And I said, "Well, you know, you have run for this office a few times now unsuccessfully." But I had a sense he was going to win. Times were changing. The movement was growing, and he was growing as a man and as a leader. And he cut off his ponytail, and he bought a cheap secondhand suit and some used wingtips, and he hit the trail. And I got to be with him for that, for his own election and for our fight against the Briggs Initiative, Prop 6, which would have made it illegal for gay people or their supporters to work in any capacity in any public school in the state of California. And I got to be with him. And, you know, at the time, I was a pretty heterophobic kid. I didn't really like straight people very much at all. I was frightened of them. I'd been beaten up a few too many times, and I think, isn't that what hate is rooted in almost all the time? It's fear. In my case, though, I think the fear was pretty justified, and I wanted to live in a ghetto. And if you'd given me bricks and mortar, I would have happily built a wall around the Castro. That's what I wanted. And then I met Harvey Milk, this older guy, Jewish from New York, who in a matter of months seemed to just capture the heart of the city. And I saw how fearless he was at the bus stops, in the union halls, in the senior centers, in every neighborhood in the city, just walking up to people and saying, "Hi, I'm Harvey Milk. What's your story? What are you concerned about?" And he would begin a conversation. And in that conversation, he would be looking for that point of common ground. And he would find that and he would build on it. And he could do it with homeless people pushing shop carts. He could do it with rich white ladies from Nob Hill. He could do it with me and the other street kids that he encountered, with the hippies, with the old union guys. He just was able to find that connection and build on that. And he reminded me that the movement I had signed up for when I was 13 years old was the movement for peace and for social and economic justice, the larger movement that affects everyone on this planet. So I was so lucky, and he won. And he kept his promise and took me with him to City Hall. This was an incredible experience for a kid. I was 23, 24, and got to work with on the kind of boring day-to-day issues of getting a stop sign put in at a dangerous intersection, working with various neighborhood groups, trying to make sure that we had housing for senior citizens, those kinds of issues. But I also got to work on the gay rights bill that would protect gay people from discrimination in housing and employment, which he ultimately was able to get passed by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And I worked with him on the Briggs Initiative fight, which was something we never expected to win. And then in November of 1978, the first week of November, the first Tuesday, we won statewide in California. And we did it without multi-million-dollar media buys. We didn't have millions of dollars then. We did it with a grassroots campaign where ordinary gay people and their friends and family went up and down the streets of California and knocked on those doors and said, "Please don't vote for this. If you vote for this, it will hurt me. It will hurt my family." And thousands upon thousands of people came out of the closet. Many of them were teachers who did so at great risk to their own security. But we came out and we spoke out and we organized and we knocked on every door in California and told the voters of California why they had to defeat Prop 6, and we won that election. We wouldn't win another statewide election anywhere in this country until just a couple of years ago. But we did it back then because we did it right. I was so proud to be part of that and to be with Harvey on his victory night. Another thing that was amazing for me was that in October, just before the election, he remembered it was my birthday on the very day he debated John Briggs. And there's a photo in the old bar, it used to be called Harvey's, it used to be called the Elephant Walk, now it's Harvey's, but there's a picture of 24-year-old me sitting with Harvey, and he brought a donut and stuck a candle in it. And that was my birthday for 1978. On November 27th, I went to work early because there were two paid assistants. Dick Pavich was one, and a woman named Ann Cronenberg. And Annie had to go up to Seattle to visit her parents that week. So she asked me to make sure I would get into the office early and do whatever I could to help Harvey. I got in, and he asked for a file that I'd left at home on Castro Street. And I could tell he was a little bit annoyed, and I got flustered. And I said, "Well, I'll go right now and get it." And he said, "Calm down, but we need that file. I need it this afternoon, so why don't you go back to Castro, get the file, have a nice lunch, and come back, and we'll get some work done." I said, "All right," and got back to my apartment, got the file, and as I'm walking down Castro Street heading towards Market, I saw a picket line outside a restaurant called the Patio Cafe, which the union that I now work for, Local 2 of Unite Here International Union, was trying to organize. The owner was an awful man, and I was happy to join the picket line. I'm doing a few turns on the line, and the 24 Divisadero bus pulled up. A young woman opened the window and screamed out the window at me, "Cleve, I just heard it on the radio. Somebody killed the mayor." I knew George Moscone. He was a good man, very charismatic. He and Harvey really created the idea of the Progressive Coalition that would bring together labor unions and feminists and environmentalists and the community we now call LGBT. I was horrified. I got in a taxi. I got to City Hall, and I arrived at the Van Ness Street exit on the west side of the building. The mayor's office is on the east side. The supervisor's chambers are on the west. And as I walked in the door of that beautiful, amazing building, I saw all the cops over by the mayor's office, and I was afraid of them, and I ran up the stairs. Harvey taught me never to take the elevator. You always walk up those stairs. And I got there, and at that time, there was a private hallway that ran parallel to the public hallway with a small corridor connecting them with a door, and I had a key to that door, and I let myself in. And as I came around the corner, I saw Dianne Feinstein running towards me and with her hand outstretched, and on her hand I saw some blood. And I thought, my God, what has happened? And then I turned the corner, and I saw Harvey's feet sticking out into the hallway from Dan White's office, and I knew it was him immediately because I recognized the secondhand wingtip shoes. And I remember peering in, and there was a police officer kneeling who was rolling Harvey's body over, and I saw his head roll. And, it was just the most horrific thing I have ever seen in my life. And I've seen a lot. But at that point, I was 24 years old. I'd never seen a dead person before. I'd never seen up close what bullets do. And my mind froze. And they wouldn't let us out. We had to sit in Harvey's office and wait while they bundled up the bodies and got them out. And we found the audio tape that he had left for us to play when he predicted his assassination. I knew he'd made the tape. I used to tease him about it. I said, "You're not that important. Who do you think you are? You're not Dr. King. You're not going to be assassinated." And then as I began to really comprehend what had happened, what kept going through my mind was, it's over. It's all over. He was my friend. He was my mentor. He was a father figure to me. He was our leader. And I just felt that everything was over. And then the sun went down. And the people began to gather. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, gay and straight, young and old, black and brown and white, people from every neighborhood and every community in the Bay Area, flowing into the Castro and lighting their candles, and then beginning the long walk in silence down Market Street to Civic Center. And if you've seen that in Milk, that's not computer-generated graphics. That's archival footage. That was what it looked like. We turned Market Street into a river of candlelight, and we filled Civic Center Plaza. And as I stood there in that amazing lake of candlelight, I realized it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I think all of us were in shock, but there was also such a powerful sense of solidarity. And everyone in that plaza, you didn't even have to say it out loud. We knew that we would never let his life be in vain. And that was the pledge I made to him that night, that I would do whatever I could for as long as I lived to make sure that his name and his message and that the movement he stood for was remembered. It was a long winter. Dianne Feinstein became mayor. Suddenly the police are harassing people in the bars again. They impaneled a jury, and somehow in San Francisco they managed to come up with a jury that was all straight and all white. That's quite an achievement. And people began to get skeptical and talk, what's going to happen? And then on May 21st, 1979, the verdict came down, and I was in my apartment on Castro Street, and the phone rang, and of course then we only had landlines, and they were usually stuck to the wall in the kitchen, and they had a long cord, and it was a reporter who was down at the courthouse, so I took the cord and I went into the bathroom so I could get some quiet, and she told me he got off. Manslaughter for Moscone, manslaughter for Milk, potential maximum sentence of 7 years. My first reaction was to vomit. I became physically ill, and when I got out of the bathroom, I cleaned up and washed my face, and I get out of the bathroom, and my apartment's already filled with people, furious, just enraged. And they said there were cameras down on Castro Street at Market, and we should get down there, and we got down there, and the reporters knew that I had a permit to close Castro Street the next day, because the next day was Harvey's birthday, our first birthday without him, and I wanted to have a party on Castro Street to remember him. So I'd gone through the channels and got the permits, and the reporter said, "Is the reaction going to be tomorrow at Harvey's birthday?" And I said, "No, the reaction will be tonight." And within 15 minutes, there were 5,000 people, then 10,000, then 30, and we didn't march in silence that night. We ran screaming bloody murder all the way down Market Street to City Hall. We surrounded City Hall, the police attacked, we fought back, they retreated, they left all their cars behind, we burned every one of them. It was the White Night Riot. And I was blamed in the media, and I had to go through a grand jury experience, which is a whole long story I can't tell you, but educate yourselves about grand juries. And then I got a really great job. And I'm not offering this as career guidance, but in my case, I was accused of this riot, and I got a call from the Speaker of the California State Assembly, Leo T. McCarthy, offering me a job, which I immediately said yes, and I went to Sacramento and got a job working for the Democratic leadership, and I was assigned to the Health Committee. I didn't know anything about public health issues, so the first thing I did was subscribe to all of the different magazines and journals and periodicals that deal with public health issues. And among them was the MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, published by the Centers for Disease Control. And it was in June of 1981. I went into work one morning, and that was at the top of the stack of stuff to read. And in there I read the very first paragraphs that were written about the disease we now call HIV/AIDS. It described clusters of gay men of several different races in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York who were dying of two diseases in particular. One was called Kaposi sarcoma, and the other was pneumocystis pneumonia. I cut it out and I put it on the bulletin board with a question mark on it. And a few weeks later, I got a call from a man named Dr. Marcus Conant, who was at the University of California, San Francisco, a dermatologist. And he invited me to come with him up to the university hospital, where I met a young man named Simon Guzman. I didn't really meet him. I looked at his body. He couldn't speak. He was intubated and had all these wires and tubes, and he was in a isolation unit. You had to put on a spacesuit to go in the door. And I remember looking at this gaunt, emaciated, nearly dead person struggling for every breath. And then I noticed on the little table next to his bed were photographs that had been left by his mother. And one of them showed him before he got sick. And in the photograph, he's on the beach and he's lifting his little baby niece up into the sky. And she's laughing, and you can see his beautiful, deep brown eyes and this amazing, bright smile. And this athletic, beautiful Latino man in this photo. And then I look at the bed, and it was just so heartbreaking. And Dr. Conant said that he thought it was a new virus, one we had not encountered before, that it was sexually transmitted, that it had a potential dormancy of maybe a decade or more, and was fatal. And I absorbed that information, and I said, well, then a lot of us are dead. And he said, yeah, a lot. That was 1981. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. We have faced a great stigma from the outside world. There were people who celebrated what happened to us. They had bumper stickers that said, "AIDS, it's killing all the right people." The first population identified with HIV were gay men. Those were followed by IV drug users, dark-skinned Haitian immigrants, sex workers, and hemophiliacs. So it was identified early on as a gay disease. And I think that that has been the most significant and dreadful mistake made. And if we look at the true path that HIV has taken throughout the world over the decades, I think it shows us a very clear example of what the consequences of homophobia can be. We in America, the one nation on earth that had the resources and the knowledge and the institutions to stop this thing in its tracks, failed. We failed completely, absolutely. And we failed for really one reason. They said it was a gay disease, and that the only other people that are getting it are black. So let them die. And the consequence of that horrendous, profoundly evil, unscientific, stupid line of thought, the consequence today clearly includes the deaths of tens of millions of heterosexual men and women and their children. So I think it's just another example of how all of us are linked, and we have to look at our lives that way. It was a desperate time. Everyone I knew was sick or dead. Everyone was fighting hard. And by the end of 85, 86, I could feel people just being paralyzed with grief. And in November of 1985, as the fall was coming, I could feel myself shutting down. I just didn't know that I had any more strength to continue. And the annual Candlelight March for Harvey and George was coming up, because every November 27th, even if it comes on Thanksgiving or even if it's pouring rain, people gather at the corner of Castro and Market and light their candles and walk down to City Hall like we did on that terrible night in 1978. So I'm walking up and down Castro Street a few days before November 27th, 1985, and I've got some stacks of flyers. Do any of you know what a mimeograph machine was? That's how we organized then. We had payphones and mimeograph machines and bullhorns, and I'm walking up and down Castro Street with these mimeograph flyers reminding people that the Candlelight March is coming up. I stopped at Marcello's Pizza Parlor. It's still there, the corner of Castro and Market. Got a slice of pizza and a Coke with my buddy Joseph. We're standing on the sidewalk leaning up against the newspaper racks, taking a break before we started flyering, and Joseph pulls out the San Francisco Chronicle, and on the front page headline it says, 1,000 dead in SF from AIDS. I was so struck by that headline and that number, because as I stood there at the corner of Castro and Market and looked around, I realized that of those first 1,000 to die, almost every one of them had lived and died within 6 blocks of where I was standing at that moment. And if you go to Castro Street today, it looks much the same, beautifully restored Victorians, and you'll smell food and coffee and hear music from the clubs, and there's just no clue that you're standing at the epicenter of this horrendous human tragedy. And I remember saying to Joseph, if I had a bulldozer, I'd knock down these buildings, and maybe if people saw 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, they would see it, they would understand what it meant, and if they were human beings, they would respond. Most of you are very young, but you should know that there was no response. We were on our own. We had a president at the time who has since been elevated to sainthood in some quarters, who would not say the word AIDS in public until more Americans had died of AIDS than died in the entire Vietnam War. And when they did speak of it, they spoke with hatred and cruelty. And I was so angry and I was so frightened, and it seemed like everybody I knew was going to die and nobody would even know that we ever existed. So on November 27th, 1985, as people gathered for the annual Candlelight March, Joseph and I had stacks of poster board and sacks of magic markers, and I had Harvey Milk's old bullhorn. And I said to them, you know, we've lost a lot more than Harvey. We've lost a lot more than George. How many of you have lost someone? And people were afraid to speak up. And I said, write down their names. People were putting initials, or say, write Tom. And then one kid taped 2 pieces of cardboard together and wrote Thomas W. Varnsbill, my brother. And other people looked at that and became ashamed of their shame and began to write the first and last names of their friends and lovers and neighbors and colleagues who had died. It's hard for you to imagine what an act of courage that was for people at that time. But those days, you know, there were rarely funerals or memorials. There'd be maybe a death notice saying he died after a long illness or unspecified cancer. And the families would come in and they'd sell the furniture and burn the body and leave. And there's people to this day, I don't know what happened to them. But people began to write the first and last names. And then we marched, as we always do, down Market Street to City Hall. And we left our candles there for Harvey and for George at the steps of City Hall and around the Abraham Lincoln statue. Then I had everybody walk another 2 blocks down Civic Center to the old Federal Building, where Reagan's Health and Human Services Division, West Coast Division, was headquartered. And earlier we'd hidden extension ladders in the shrubbery. And I got a nun with a beard on a bicycle to distract the police over here. And then we pushed through and we put our ladders up against the wall and we climbed up with big rolls of tape on our wrists and we covered the gray stone facade of the old Federal Building with the names of our dead. It was a cold night, drizzly. There were no speeches or music, no chants, just thousands and thousands of people standing in the drizzle and reading these names on the wall and whispering to each other. And when I got off my ladder and walked through the crowd, I could hear what they were saying. I didn't know he was dead. When did George die? I didn't know Frank was sick. I went to school with him. Oh my God, we were from the same hometown. And you know, you could just feel this deep yearning need not only to find a way to grieve together for our friends who had died so young and so horribly, but also to try to find a way to break through the stupidity and ignorance and cruelty and greed that even today hampers our ability to respond to what has become the worst pandemic in human history. And I got to the edge of the crowd and looked back over the heads of the crowd at that strange patchwork of names on the wall, and I thought to myself, it looks like a quilt. I thought of my grandma. I thought of my great-grandma back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, and the quilts that she had made from remnants of my great-grandpa's pajamas. One of them's on my bed at home right now, and that was such a warm and comforting and middle-class, middle-American, traditional family values sort of symbol. And I believe in traditional family values, and I believe that they should apply to me and to my family. And I wanted to reclaim that notion. And I thought of the Conestoga wagons crossing the prairie and the pioneer women at the cook fire sewing and the slaves in the South digging out remnants of fabric from the garbage and sewing them together into things that had beauty and gave warmth and comfort. And I thought, I'm going to make a quilt. Everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. I swear, gay people, they make me nuts. But really, it's like, this is the story of my life. You can't do that. Nobody will do that. That's a stupid idea. It's too expensive. It's too complicated. Cleve, forget it. Nobody's going to do it. So I still can't sew, but we did it. And it's a long and amazing story, but basically what happened was that tens of thousands of people all across this country and ultimately around the world took up needle and thread and began to sew quilts to memorialize their loved ones and neighbors and friends and colleagues. And those quilts were assembled and displayed. And the first display was October 11th, 1987. It was a year and a day after the death of my best friend, Marvin Feldman, and I dedicated it to him. And we were on the front page of every newspaper in the world. And then the requests started coming in. Please, please, you have no idea how bad it is where we live. Would you bring the quilt to our community? So I bought a truck named Stella, and I looked for the biggest, meanest truck driver I could find. Her name was Deborah, and we headed out on the road. And we would spend the next 5 years pretty much just traveling around, displaying the quilt in local communities as a centerpiece for locally coordinated fundraising and educational campaigns. And I think I can say with some certainty that what we did helped change the way America looked at AIDS. I think another thing that happened then was that America came to know her gay children at the time of our greatest suffering and was moved. It's hard to stay in the closet when you're dying of AIDS. It's hard to stay in the closet when you're caring for your partner of 18 years while he's dying of AIDS. So we began to come out in numbers that we'd never seen before. And as more and more people came out, we discovered resources that we did not have, skills that we did not know we had, abilities we did not know we had. In the mid-70s, the idea of any gay community in the country being able to raise $50,000 was really unlikely. But within 5 years, gay communities across this country and Europe were routinely spending millions of dollars every year to care for our brothers and sisters and to create the social services and infrastructure necessary in the continuing vacuum of any kind of government response. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to come up with some silver lining. I miss my friends very much. But we learned some very important lessons. I didn't get sick until 1993. And then I got very sick very suddenly. And I moved out to the Sonoma County. My cousins and my mom and dad and aunts and uncles all pitched in and gave me $10,000. They thought maybe I would like to take one last trip, travel somewhere. But I wanted control over my environment when I died. So I bought a little cabin out in the Redwoods on the Russian River, down by Duncan's Mills, if you know where that is, and got ready to die. And then Dr. Marcus Conant called me one day, and he said, you need to start treatment. I said, don't tell me to take AZT, because everyone I know who's taking AZT is dying faster than the others. AZT was the first anti-HIV medication. It's a class of drugs called nucleoside analogs. He said, well, we were giving the wrong dose. And there's a new trial that's got 3 drugs, and we're giving a combination of these 3 drugs in very small amounts. It's what we now call the cocktail, which is a slander against vodka tonics, believe me. So I was one of the very first people on the planet to get access to this new idea of fighting back with highly active antiretroviral medications. My T cells, which is how we measure the functionality of one's immune system. The T cells are the specialized cells that direct the human immune system. These are the cells that HIV attaches to and replicates through as they destroy them. So in a healthy person, you want to about a level of about 1,000. And if you're under 200, you're vulnerable to every one of the opportunistic infections that kill people with AIDS. My T cells were down to 23. I had named them. And within 2 weeks, my T cells went up to 350. And I've been through a lot with them, with the side effects and all the different kinds of drugs over the years. But I just turned 60. I'm alive, I'm strong, and I'm working hard. About 10 years ago, I was approached by a union, the Unite Here. I referenced Local 2 in San Francisco. And I was asked to consult with them because they wanted to get a message to the LGBT community, to get LGBT people to support the workers in these big hotels that are owned by multinationals. And I went and met with these union guys, and I said, you know, it's really unfortunate that none of you seem to be able to speak English or Spanish or Mandarin or any other useful language. You just seem to talk this union jargon. And nobody knows what the hell you're talking about. And he said, well, why don't you translate? So I started writing articles about why gay people and why progressives should support the hotel workers who were on strike in San Francisco at that time. And ultimately, I went to work for the union. I've been doing that for the last 10 years. And what I love so much about my union is we fight hard. We believe in the value of all human beings. We don't care what your color of skin you have or what kind of papers you've got in your wallet. We don't care about your gender or your sexual orientation. We care about working class people, and our mission is to raise working class people out of poverty. So we fight for those people that are the most vulnerable in our society today. And one of the things I love so much about my job is that it is so grounded in the reality of the experience of working class people. So yes, I care about LGBT issues and I care about HIV/AIDS, but I will tell you, with as much strength as I can muster, that the single greatest challenge facing us all on this planet today, it is not those issues, it is the growing chasm between rich and poor and how that prevents us from addressing all of the other issues. So I belong to the big movement, and I think a movement that fights only to advance the narrow interests of its own memberships is a shallow movement destined over time to accomplish little. But those of us, ordinary men and women all across the planet who understand that our lives are linked, and that to me is the message that the AIDS quilt proclaims, and the lesson that we had to learn from AIDS. All of our lives are linked. We inhabit a tiny and beautiful planet, and what happens to any of us on any of the parts of this planet affect all of us, and that is not liberal rhetoric. It is the reality of our lives on this planet today. What you do, the decisions you make, matter. They matter to you and to your family and to your communities, your neighborhoods. It matters what you do. And don't ever, ever let anybody tell you that your vote doesn't count or your work doesn't count or you don't count or you don't have any power. There's a lot of people that would like you to believe you are powerless. You are not powerless, and don't ever let anyone feed you that lie. Now, I have one anecdote that I conclude every speech with. Some of you have probably heard it before, but before we do that, could we turn up the house lights? And I'm waiting for my intelligent questions. Oh, aren't you attractive? Oh, nice. Yes, intelligent remarks or questions. The question is, where is the quilt today? The quilt is living mostly in a giant storage unit in Atlanta, Georgia. When I got sick, I lost control of the quilt, and I've had a big ongoing dispute with the people that are in charge of it now, who I think are well-meaning, but they moved the quilt to Atlanta with the idea that they were going to create a museum around it. Well, to me, that was a bit like talking about, you don't start talking about building the Holocaust Museum in 1937, I think maybe a museum will be appropriate at some day in the future when a vaccine and a cure have arrived. But I have an ongoing quarrel with them, and also they don't seem to understand the value of the quilt as a prevention education tool. But that quilt, we took that to high schools and colleges all over the country. We were able to get into school districts there where no other AIDS education was going on because the quilt was endorsed by the Pope and the President and the PTA. I mean, I traveled all over Utah with it. So it's frustrating to me that it's not being used for prevention education, especially now that we've seen this really kind of disheartening and fairly dramatic increase in new infections among young gay and bisexual identified men under 25. So it's in Atlanta, and I'm not happy about it. Yes? Yes, we do. She asked if we still walk on November 27th. We do. Now, I was away for several years. I was in Sonoma County for a while, and then every time I kept trying to come back to Castro Street, but it was too painful for a really long time. I just, there's ghosts everywhere for me. But I finally came home. I've been home 4 years now, living right back 2 blocks from where I started. And so last year I kicked up a rumpus, and we got the march was much larger than it's been dwindling, but we decided to focus on the gravest threat for long-term survivors of HIV in San Francisco. Can anybody guess what that would be? Housing, Got a town now where studio apartments go for $4 grand. So all of the survivors, the long-term survivors like myself, and all of the people who really powered the LGBT rights movement are being forced out. I don't know how young people can come to San Francisco unless they're trust fund babies. So last year we transformed the annual march into a statement about the need for affordable housing, and it kicked off this a new kind of movement to try to fight back against the speculators and other interests that are driving up the cost of housing so dramatically. Anybody else? Yes? I hate it when I get these introspective, he asked me where I get my strength, and I was a very timid little kid. I was really kind of pathetic, and I never fought back, and I would get beat up. Like the first day of 8th grade, Carl Ketchum beat me up in front of everybody in the school. He has since apologized, and we are friends. He's a good man. But I just didn't want to be that person anymore. I really didn't. And then I read in like some silly magazine, like Reader's Digest or something, I read this piece of advice, and it said, make a list of the things that you're most afraid of and do them until you're no longer afraid of them. And I thought, well, I'm afraid of hitchhiking, I'm afraid of having sex, and I'm afraid of public speaking. I enjoy all of them quite much now. and also my grandmothers. My grandmothers were really strong, amazing women who, if you're the first grandkid, you get a lot of love. And they always encouraged me, and they understood, I think, more than my parents what I was going through, and I still think of them and love them every single day. I hope all of you have grandmothers like I had with mine. Anyone else? Yes, you in the back. I have so many complex and conflicting views and opinions about this new generation coming up. I would start with anxiety, because I think you're coming into a world that's really difficult. So I don't envy your position. I think it's a really difficult time. My general impressions are that you're a very consumer-oriented generation, that you love your toys. I'm concerned about the impact of the communications technology on your abilities to socialize and solve problems. I have a lot of friends who work in various human resource departments, and there's a pattern of young people coming out of their 4 years or 6 years with exemplary grades and great record and the rest of it, but they have real social skill issues. I think it's too much time in the bubble. I'm suspicious and skeptical of a whole lot of the online activism, even though I use it, and I think I use it for an old guy quite effectively. But if you think clicking a mouse is going to change the world, you're an idiot. I'm sorry. You know, it's not. And there's a whole new vocabulary that troubles me. Like I'll give you an example. This is for the white people in the audience. I hear people using this expression about how we need to acknowledge our privilege. And then I hear white people, especially this new generation, kind of saying, well, you know, I acknowledge my privilege as a white man. And then, what do you do with this understanding? You know, so I feel like there's a kind of very self-absorbed thing going on with this generation that seems to think that the most important contribution they can have is to recognize their privilege. What about dismantling the privilege? What about spreading that privilege around? So I'm always encouraging young people who say they have progressive values to do something like work with my union. You know, spend a summer working with my union. Spend a summer working with poor people who get up at the crack of dawn every day and take a bus for an hour and a half into work and then work all day and take the bus home and then are raising their kids and putting them through college, and get yourself grounded in the reality of how most of us are living. You know, I'm not comfortable with the preoccupation with accumulating wealth that I hear so often expressed by young people. But I want to also balance that by saying that I am so grateful for the love and respect that I receive from young people everywhere I go. Everywhere I go, I meet young people who want to make a difference. Even in San Francisco, where we're on the verge of outright class war, but with this invasion of tech workers that have really obliterated entire neighborhoods, vanished communities, and are wreaking havoc on our entire city. I know that not everyone on those Google buses is a jerk, though I still want to throw eggs at them every time I see them. And so I think, part of our struggle right now is to find the vocabulary and the conversation that can connect these generations, because we have some really important tasks ahead of us. And turn off the stuff every now and then and go outside and, make eye contact with people. It's exciting. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, yes? Oh, that's not personal at all. So my T cells are right around 800, 900, which is perfectly good. These days we have a more accurate marker of people, a way of determining how people are responding to the medications, and that's called the viral load. So we're able to actually, take a simple blood test and determine how many copies of the virus are active in your bloodstream. The goal then, I'm so glad that you asked this question, because it will segue to something I wouldn't want to leave here without bringing up. So, I have had now an undetectable viral load for almost 9 years. So, and again, I mentioned, I've had to go through all sorts of crap with side effects in the old days, but the newer drugs, the medications I'm on now, so far, no side effects whatsoever. But what's important is not just the fact that I made it, and I'm glad I made it, but if I were to have unprotected sex with another guy, or if a condom were to break or something like that, or if I was to be irresponsible, the odds of me transmitting the virus are reduced to very, very, very low, because there's not enough of the active virus in my bloodstream for me to be likely to transmit it to someone else. And now today, it is absolutely clear that uninfected individuals who take just one pill a day in what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis reduce their likelihood of getting the disease to almost zero. So today we know that even for very sexually active young men who are in the gay scene, who are going down to Castro Street and maybe drinking too much, maybe doing E, whatever, people make mistakes. And now we know that treatment equals prevention. For my generation, the slogan was silence equals death, and there was a lot of both. But for this generation, and so what I want all of you to know, those of you who are sexually active, whether you're gay or straight or male or female, that if you are sexually active, you ought to consider the possibility, and you ought to talk to your physician openly, and if you're not comfortable with that, find yourself a better physician, and take those steps. Because I'm still in touch with many of the leading researchers, and they don't see any realistic hope for a vaccine or cure anytime soon. But now we see a path forward to dramatically reducing, if not eliminating, HIV through treatment. Okay, so protect yourselves, and there's no more questions, so I want to just close with my last little anecdote. I told you about Stella and Deborah and going out on tour with the quilt, and after every display, people would come, long lines of women of all colors and circumstances, giving us the quilts they'd made for their own children. And we wanted so much to show the quilt to San Francisco, which had still never seen it. I think we showed it in Sacramento before we showed it in San Francisco. And so we went to the city, and they let us use the Moscone Auditorium, named after George Moscone, murdered with Harvey Milk all those years before. And all of the school districts sent their kids in to help with the unfolding of the quilt and the reading of the names that we do at the opening ceremony. It was a magnificent, beautiful display, broadcast live on Channel 5. And by the time the reading of the names was completed, I was so tired, and I just wanted to go back to our office on Market Street at Castro and have a little time to myself. I got back to the workshop, and it was empty. The radio was off. The sewing machines were silent. There was nobody there but me and the stacks of fabric and a few panels that had come in too late to be included in the display. But there was a big stack of bills on my desk, so I sat down and started figuring out what I needed to pay now and which ones I could stall, and I'm just doing that work, and I got that weird back-of-the-neck sensation I was being watched. I turned around, and I saw an old woman standing on Market Street on the sidewalk, peering in through the plate glass windows. She was African American. She had very dark brown skin, deeply lined. She was wearing a pale blue dress. And I went and opened the door. She crossed her arms, and she looked at the ground, and I said, "We're open, you can come in, but the quilt's not here. It's down at Moscone Center. I can call you a taxi or show you how to get there by bus." And she didn't say anything, so I left her alone. She sat down by a sewing machine. She picked up a couple of our brochures. She looked at some pieces of fabric, and then she left. I didn't even hear her leave. I just looked up, and she was gone. A couple of days passed, and the display at Moscone Center was concluded, and the workshop was again filled with people, and the sewing machines were going, and the radio's on, and a group of people in one corner are laughing as they tell stories about their crazy gay uncle, and the people in the other corner are weeping as they talk about their grandmother who got it through a transfusion. And in the middle of that chaos and general madness that the Names Project Workshop was at that time, I looked up and saw this old woman walking through the door again. She had the same frown on her face, and her arms were tight across her chest. But as she came in, we saw she had a piece of fabric in her arms. She told us she'd come to San Francisco by herself on a Greyhound bus from Kentucky, and that a few months earlier, her eldest son, her baby boy, came home from LA where he'd settled after serving in Vietnam. And he was sick, and she took care of him without ever revealing to another human being the nature of her son's disease. She was the matriarch of a large extended family. She told no one. She had been the choir director and still played piano at her church, but she didn't tell the pastor or anyone in the congregation. And by herself, over many months, this woman cared for her son as he died. Now, most of you are young and have not yet had to do that, but you all will. And some of you who are not so young in this room have done it more times than you care to think about. But for those of you who haven't, just let me tell you, it's really hard. It's really hard physically and emotionally and spiritually. And by herself, this old woman cared for her son until his time was up. She called the ambulance. She rode with him to the county hospital. It was only a few blocks from their house, and she waited there until it was over. And she said goodbye to him, and she walked alone back to her little house. And she told us that when she opened the front door, she looked across the living room to the spare bedroom where he had been, and she saw the IV rack and the towels and the bedpan and the pill containers, and she couldn't deal with it, and she closed the door and locked it and never opened it again. Months passed. She's waiting for a dentist appointment and happens to pick up a back issue of People magazine. And she's reading through that and comes across a story about the AIDS memorial quilt. And she went home and she packed her bags and got on a Greyhound bus and traveled across the United States to the corner of Castro and Market. She told us this story. She unfolded the fabric in her arms and said, "This is my son. I have to go home now and clean out his room." We took the panel and she left. We never saw her again. But I'll never forget, just how incredibly grateful I felt at that moment, and so proud. We who were in San Francisco, who were mostly young and white and gay and dying, had succeeded. We had created this thing, and it found this old woman alone with her grief in the hills of Appalachia and connected her and her son with all of us, all the many different kinds of people across this planet who, in the course of fighting back against this disease and against racism and against war and injustice, have learned how tiny the planet is and how irrevocably all of our lives are linked. That's something I suspect every one of you already knew in your heart, or you wouldn't have bothered to show up and listen to me tonight. And for that, I want to thank you and tell you how grateful I am for that. So thank you all very much for inviting me to your school. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.